This is the Cold War nuclear simulation rules briefing. It's basically built around a hypothesis test between Lanchester and Borden on the one hand, against Schelling and Brodie on the other. It's two different philosophies of how to fight a nuclear war. The first one basically envisions nuclear war as an artillery exchange in which there are incentives to follow the logic of the Lanchester Square Law. And the incentive is to launch nuclear weapons as quickly as possible. And because the benefit is an inverse hyperbolic tan difference in losses between the attacker and the recipient of the attack. So it essentially emphasizes the benefits of initiative. In this conception, and this is the military's perspective typically, and it's not one that's often taught in academic universities, is that cities would be preserved as hostages. So the attack would be primarily counterforce, and the victor in the counterforce campaign would then be able to dictate terms to the other state that had been disarmed or more physically damaged. So it doesn't mean that there wouldn't be significant civilian losses, because counterforce can be fairly destructive to the habitable environment, but that the focus is on the nuclear weapons themselves, and they should be treated as weapons. And there isn't a fundamental break with the prior logic of nuclear weapons from artillery. Now, the second conception comes from Bernard Brodie and Schelling, and they argue that nuclear war is very dangerous because it facilitates the ability to destroy an opponent entirely. Therefore, the goal should not be to fight a war to its conclusion, a nuclear war, because a nuclear war is unwinnable in the sense that, with the exception of survival, the use of nuclear weapons for any other purpose is outweighed by the damage of the nuclear exchange. So there's no political goal except survival that can be achieved by launching all of nuclear weapons. In this in perspective, rather, a nuclear war is essentially a negotiating process between two sides in which the slowness of the nuclear exchange is encouraged to allow for negotiation, to allow for interaction that indicates critical lines around which the parties coalesce, the division of their interests. And so it's essentially a learning process between two states that have unlimited power but limited targets. Now, in this conception, although cities would not necessarily be attacked initially, there is a need to demonstrate credibility, and in the process of negotiating, it may be required to destroy a city. So these two conceptions are very different from each other. One is launch quickly, the other one is don't launch quickly, launch slowly. Two completely different philosophies. You can see at the bottom my article on the subject as it pertains to this game, if you have further interest in the background. Now, in the classroom, students are subjected to a Schelling test, and they are then ranked from most likely to be able to communicate intuitively to least likely to be able to communicate intuitively during a nuclear exchange. And that indicator for a student is important because we associate the greater level of intuitive ability to communicate essentially as a measure of a student's ability to tacitly communicate with another and then to figure out the common point of legitimacy between the two around which they can negotiate. So essentially looking into the other's mind. Those that are least empathetic are at the other end of the scale, and we would associate them with a Lanchesterian approach of launching nuclear weapons as quickly as possible. And so this simulation, the Cold War simulation, and the multipolar nuclear war simulation are meant to test opposite aspects of these simulations. In the Cold War simulation, we have the ultimate simplicity, and therefore we would expect those that are the most empathetic, who are given the positions of leadership in the simulation, to be able to negotiate a simple conflict between a small number of states, we would expect them to be able to negotiate it to peace and to avoid escalation. So it's really a test against that philosophy, against the inherent tensions of the process of a nuclear war. Now, because the students are ranked from highest to lowest on the Schelling test of empathy, as players are decapitated by nuclear decapitation attacks, they are replaced by less empathetic leaders. And as they are decapitated, there are even less empathetic players. And at the very bottom, the very last player for each state is the least empathetic person. So we expect that as decapitation strikes are conducted on each other's command and control systems, that you push the system towards a more Lanchesterian type of system. So a couple of important points for the simulation itself, which moves very quickly. Number one, students have to use the correct format, or I will simply rip up their orders. They've got to get their orders in on time, or I will ignore them. Students must keep track of their own nuclear assets. It's not my job. Don't argue with me. We will use a calculator for the random function for measuring a spasmodic or catalytic nuclear war. We'll talk about that later. So there are essentially 5 teams. The leaders of the teams are the most empathetic individuals according to the Schelling test. We have a red team, a blue team, a Chinese team, a French team, and an English team. And they all have their own assets. So an individual turn, and turns last about 2 minutes. There's democratic voting among the survivors in the leadership of each state, although the target selection is proposed by the current leader. Each 2 minutes represents about 6 hours in the actual combat simulation, and most of these simulations last about 45 minutes. Some of them last even less. They really move very quickly. If a player doesn't do anything, then nothing happens. Players may launch no more than 300 missiles and bombers per turn, 200 if they've been decapitated the previous turn, unless they have a SIOP in effect. A SIOP is a single integrated operating plan. It's basically a computer plan to launch the missiles faster and automatically. Missiles and bombers launched the same turn cannot be affected by attacks that turn. So everything assumes there's a launch under attack capability. So they launch before they're struck. The format for every attack must be written on a little piece of paper and needs the name of the country on the top, the source of the weapon, how many are launched, and what the target is. And it's got to be put in the palm of my hand before the stopwatch runs out. Targets can be counter value, at least those that are in range, which you would just simply say we launched this many nuclear weapons at cities. And counterforce is more complicated. You have to indicate what kind of weapon you're trying to destroy, and we have to refer to a chart to see how that plays out. The game lasts until all the sides are militarily exhausted or stalemated. They come to a negotiated solution. Sequence of play, 3 basic steps. The first one is the orders or the SIOP. Either students give me an order or they give me an entire 8.5 by 11 with their SIOP listed, and it would indicate how many nukes are launched. We then calculate the effects, and then we adjust the nuclear numbers. We then adjust the conventional intensity of the conflict. There are conflicts using tactical nuclear weapons in different theaters across the globe, and these can feed back on the probability of a nuclear escalation that goes from the tactical to the theater to the strategic. And these are beyond the control of the players. We would then adjust the overall probability of the spasmodic escalation, depending on how the players adjust the conventional intensity. And then we would estimate if there's a victory on any front, whether, for example, the Soviets have made it to Paris, or whether the Americans have pushed into the Russian Far East. So this is the exchange chart for a counterforce exchange. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a column. Those are the items to be destroyed, and on the left, on the right column are the items that are required. Any one of. So it's not all of them. It's an or statement between them. So any one of. So to destroy a silo ICBM, you need 1 ICBM or 1 SLBM or 1 bomber or 1 IRBM. SLBM, of course, are sea-launched ballistic missiles. ICBMs are intercontinental ballistic missiles, and IRBMs are intermediate-range ballistic missiles. If you go down to mobile ICBMs, you need 1 bomber or 3 ICBMs or 3 IRBMs. To destroy a fixed IRBM, you need half an ICBM or half an IRBM or half a carrier-borne aircraft or half a bomber. Obviously, that's not, you can't launch half a bomber. You'd launch a full bomber or a full ICBM, and it would destroy 2. To destroy mobile IRBM would be 1 bomber or 3 ICBMs or 3 IRBMs. SLBMs essentially refer to SSBNs, or ballistic missile submarines, and to destroy one of those takes half a carrier aircraft. To destroy a carrier-based aircraft takes a bomber, and to destroy bombers requires what are listed there on the chart. So it's these become fairly intuitive when you've done it quite a few times. So the exchange chart affects bombers and carriers suffer a 50% casualty every turn they're used, irrespective of the mission. That's rounded down. So if the Americans launch 100 B-52s, 50 will come back. They suffer 100% casualties when they're launched against carriers. So there's sort of a one-to-one trade-off there. The U.S., the U.K., France may not attack each other, although if a ballistic missile comes out of the mid-Atlantic, it's always a wonder as to does it belong to the Americans, the French, or the British? And so when the Russians retaliate, who knows? It gets a little bit sticky there. So this is the chart I use, and it's represented on the map. The sections in red are blotted out because there are asymmetric intelligence for the different countries. So some countries don't know what other countries have, and this is the maximalist lack of knowledge which comes from China, which doesn't have much information at all. The chart that we looked at before is in the top left-hand corner. Underneath it are how many missiles can be launched. 400 can be launched per turn if there's a SIOP, 300 under normal circumstances, and 200 if in the previous term there was a decapitation. And you can also see the intensity calculation we'll talk about later, which is also represented in the middle bottom, the total intensity chart from 1 to 12. And you can see small little boxes in areas that are sort of in sequence, and those represent the different tactical theater areas that can be captured. And you can see there's a US area on the left and a Cuba on the bottom left, and in the middle top you've got the UK, the US, and France. And you got China in the bottom right, and you got Russia in the top right, and all the different assets they have. And obviously Tupolev 26s are bombers, B-52s are bombers, and everything else is more or less directly represented in the system. So this is the Chinese team's assets, lists them at the top. The Chinese have 10 silos, silo ICBMs, and 50 fixed IRBMs, and it lists where they are. It also indicates what kind of target they can strike, and the target location, where they can reach. So the 10 silo ICBMs can go anywhere in the world, not a lot, and the fixed IRBMs can only strike targets in East Asia. In other words, the Chinese can hit the Russians in the Far East, and that's it. Now, there are a lot of question marks in some of the assets on the left-hand side because the Chinese just don't know in detail what the assets are. They can certainly talk to the other team players and try to collect intelligence during the course of the game, but the counterforce is difficult for China because they just don't have the information on how many missiles are there. They may have been all fired. There may be a great many. There may be very few. But this is each team has this representation of the other country's assets and their own assets, and some have better intelligence and some have worse intelligence. Obviously, the Americans and Russians have the best intelligence. But you can see the different assets going all the way down to the French and the English. The English only have SLBMs, where the French have SLBMs, and they've got fixed IRBMs. I didn't include the bombers because they're such a minimal force. So here we want to look at the intensity. If you look at the intensity chart in the bottom, and you could look up at the top left corner, you'll see at the very bottom of the typed writing, it's very small, but it says intensity is equal to 8 times 1 to 8 divided by 4 is equal to 64 divided by 4 is equal to 16%. So what happens is in the different theaters, the different players can increase or decrease the level of tactical nuclear warfare intensity. Now the game begins with the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, having a value of 1. So the Russians are pushing into West Germany with 1 tactical nuclear value. And they can increase that value in every turn. And the French and English can then increase theirs as well. Now the difference in the tactical nuclear weapon values is the percentage probability that that side advances and the other side does not. So if the Russians have a GDR of 1 and the UK and French in Norway have a value of 0, then there's a 1% chance the Russians can advance into Norway. So, and if they do, they can keep advancing. So obviously the incentive for the French and the English is to increase their tactical nuclear weapon level. So at least it's matched. And you can see the British and French are responsible for the intensity level in NATO. The Russians are obviously opposite that. They're responsible for that escalation. If you look at the Middle East, the Soviets are responsible for the escalation in the Middle East, and the Americans on the other side of the Middle East. And then there's an American-Chinese trade-off, Japan, ROK, DPRK, and Shanghai. And then there's a Russian-Chinese trade-off, Siberia, Vladivostok, Manchuria, and Beijing. You basically add up all of the intensity levels. There's 8 different fronts. You divide it by 4, and that gives you between a 1 and a 16% chance of a catalytic nuclear war. If there's a catalytic nuclear war, the student SIOPs are implemented immediately. Those are the computer programs that launch nuclear weapons automatically, and we'll talk about that later. This is the formula. These are the different tactical fronts showing you who's responsible for which front. So decapitation attacks. Every attack on a command facility specified as a decapitation attack in the orders explicitly will result for a maximum of 1 per turn the removal of the leader. What typically happens is I have the students go to the corner of the classroom, and I have a couple of desks put in the corner, and that little tiny corner of the room ends up having about 20 students all squished together like sardines, standing, watching the simulation from a distance. So I call it purgatory. It's where people go when they get nuked in a decapitation attack. I'm not very nice. I basically don't let them sit down or lean against the wall. They have to stand there. It's sort of a disincentive to get decapitated. So first, the President, General Secretary are removed, and then in order of the performance on the Schelling test. So we're basically descending to less empathetic leaders. A decapitation also reduces the total number of missiles and bombers that can be launched the next turn to 200, unless a SIOP is being executed. When there are no more leaders, a state will automatically revert to its SIOP. A state suffering from a complete decapitation has its intensity levels reduced to 1 on all fronts, even if the SIOP is already invoked, with the attendant consequences for their ability to hold off enemy territorial conquests. So at some point, when you've completely wiped out the command authority of a country, their military becomes a lot less efficient. So what is a SIOP? It's the Single Integrated Operating Plan. It's basically an automatic plan, and it lists weapons launched every turn and their targets. So each state leader must submit a SIOP to me before the simulation begins. The SIOP is a plan that describes in precise detail what weapons will be launched at precisely what targets each turn. A leader may invoke a SIOP voluntarily, or it may occur either as a result of a total decapitation of a state or a regional conflict erupting out of control. That's the catalytic nuclear war effect. The SIOP launch permits 400 missiles or bombers to be launched a turn and is unaffected by prior decapitation attack penalties on total launches. Once a SIOP is invoked, it may not be turned off, and any weapons it does not launch may never be launched. So, for example, you could have a SIOP launch 400 silo missiles at the 400 silo missiles of the opponent. That's a typical American or Russian SIOP on game turn 1. A state without a SIOP simply does not launch any missiles if there is a spasmodic nuclear war or there's a total command decapitation. So the SIOP is really the ultimate Lanchesterian instrument to launch everything as quickly as possible, destroy the opponent, in a form of a damage limitation attack where you destroy the enemy's missiles quickly enough and efficiently enough that whatever they have left over isn't really a solid deterrent against you, and you'll be able to absorb the losses. So once the simulation is done, we then stare at the blackboard where I've typically portrayed all the different countries, and we look at all the mushroom clouds, and then we wonder to ourselves, who won?